We're going to talk now about the United Nations Security Council. It has backed calls for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has reportedly cancelled high-level meetings with US officials over their refusal to veto the resolution. Well, joining me now is the director of the Britain-Israel Communications and Research Centre, BICOM, Richard Pater. Richard, thank you for joining me. Israel seems very isolated now. Certainly, America has been an incredible supporter of Israel for so many years, but clearly Benjamin Netanyahu, who is isolated politically within his own country as well for lots of other reasons, is running out of places to go in terms of international support. Will that make a difference in terms of how he goes forward with the war in Gaza against Hamas terrorists, do you think?
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me.
Good afternoon.
I mean, I think the first thing that came to mind when I saw this decision yesterday reminded me of the quote from Henry Kissinger referring to Israel, that Israel has no foreign policy, only domestic policy. And for me, it strikes me that this is kind of the case both in terms of Israeli policy, but also US policy. I think President Biden, who has shown up until now almost unwavering support for Israel, understanding that they were fighting a genocidal terrorist entity in Hamas and the necessity to complete that operation, but took perhaps US domestic politics into account when making this decision not to veto. And probably similarly, Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu as well, was making a similar calculation of how this plays for a domestic audience when you can challenge and stick up for the rights of your country against the world powers.
Yes, indeed, and that will presumably help him. He is cornered to some degree. Do you think Netanyahu actually survives when this war is over, which is, of course, hopefully soon, because we don't want any of the civilian casualties? I'll shed absolutely no tears for Hamas terrorists, but the civilian casualties both in Gaza and in Israel.
I think it's still too soon to know. I mean, obviously, Israel doesn't have fixed terms elections, so there is increasing calls in Israel to go to a general election once the fighting is over, but we're certainly not there yet. But just on that point as well, I would also clarify that whilst Prime Minister Netanyahu put out his statement and has cancelled a trip of some of his very senior colleagues to go and liaise with the Americans as some form of punishment, at the same time, even the Israeli government has got a wider range of opinions than just the Prime Minister's position. And even his own Defense Minister Gallant, from Netanyahu's same party, actually is in Washington today. He was meeting with National Security Advisor yesterday. He's meeting with Secretary of Defense Austin later today. And he has emphasized during his trips the importance of remaining and keeping that close coordination with Israel's closest ally. So on one level, there is criticism, but also work is continuing as normal within the defense establishment.
You talked about Gallant there as well. He, of course, met Anthony Blinken recently as well when the US Secretary of State was in the region. And there's been caution urged on Rafah as well. What do you think will happen there in terms of an assault on Rafah?
So again, this is one of the ironies that the delegation that was meant to be leaving, represented by Israel's Strategic Affairs Minister Dermot and Israel's National Security Advisor Hanegbi, were meant to be going later this week to meet with senior US officials to discuss exactly that. For Israel, they see that an operation in Rafah is essential for four reasons, really. One, because it is the remaining hub of the Hamas military apparatus that remains in power. And if you're serious, and both the British government and the US and other allies of Israel around the world have called for the destruction of Hamas militarily, the only way you can achieve that goal is by going into Rafah. The Hamas leadership are there. It's thought that some of the hostages are there. And perhaps the fourth and most important reason, that if you believe in demilitarizing Hamas in the long term, then an operation along that Egyptian Gaza border, which has been responsible for so much smuggling of weapons and munitions, it has to be dealt with militarily in order to prevent Hamas from being able to rearm again in the future.
I wonder about the ceasefire resolution itself, Richard, because I wonder whether the resolution has actually perhaps emboldened Hamas terrorists to take a more hardline position when it comes to hostage releases, because there is that deal, it's in the air at the moment for perhaps 800 Palestinian prisoners, some of them murderers, who could be released for 40 hostages. And we know that there are many more hostages that are being held by Hamas terrorists, but they haven't been released and they're perhaps not part of this deal. I wonder what you think the attitude of Hamas will be to what's going on at the moment.
Well, the very fact that Hamas sent blessings when the vote was passed is a very bad sign for the international community. That it does embolden them, it does kind of make them more entrenched in their own positions. Of course, as you relate to, in parallel to what's happening at the UN, there are these mediation efforts to try and release some of the hostages being run by the Americans in cooperation with the Egyptians and the Qataris. And we heard in parallel to the announcement of this, by the way, I would stress a non-binding UN resolution, but in parallel to this resolution, the Hamas seem to have hardened their negotiating positions. And it's quite clear that if anyone wants to see an end to this fighting, then the pressure must be brought to bear, both diplomatically and militarily, on Hamas. Only they are capable of eventually leading to a ceasefire that will hopefully lead to an end to the fighting and a release of the hostages. But unfortunately, as a result of the UN kind of related to that, Hamas does feel emboldened, and so those talks have taken a step back.
And Hamas terrorists are just going to continue to use those hostages, some as young as one. There's a baby who's 1 year old. They're going to continue to use them as long as they can as bargaining chips, aren't they?
That's the Hamas approach. I mean, Hamas, the attack that the rest of the world may have moved on, but from Israel's perspective, we're still living on October the 7th. Yeah. And the fact that there are young women, and as you mentioned, two children at least, who are being continuously held by Hamas, and God only knows the conditions in which they're being kept in. That Israel has a responsibility. And not only a right, but a responsibility to continue to pursue this military campaign, to apply the pressure on Hamas in order to try and bring about a release of the hostages. And as the government have stated, their dual objectives of destroying Hamas's military capabilities, of removing them from political power and releasing the hostages. And there is the hope that that equation, they'll still be able to pursue both those goals.
And it's very interesting you mention that, Richard, because, of course, the allies of Israel started the war after the 7th of October and those absolutely horrendous terrorist attacks by Hamas. I've done many interviews on this, very, very interestingly and horrendously, recently about a report about rape being used as a weapon of war. Just some of those details still coming out about the 7th of October, absolutely awful. The Allies, of course, now are calling for a ceasefire. Clearly, there is a huge humanitarian cost for the innocent civilians, men, women and children in Gaza. Hamas tell us over 30,000 of them. We have to treat those statistics with a bit of caution, but there's absolutely no doubt that many, many, many people, tens of thousands of people, have been killed as a result of this war. And the tide does seem to be turning in terms of international opinion on this.
Yes, I mean, clearly Israel is slightly out of sync with their allies. As I said at the beginning, the fact that Defence Minister Gallant is still in DC and conducting those high-level talks, and I know that there's a good level of cooperation and conversations going on with senior British officials as well. And I think Israel appreciates that and the advice and guidance they receive from the international community. At the same time, they understand there is a responsibility of Israel, if not directly, to indirectly help facilitate the aid going in. I know that just yesterday, the army that handles the humanitarian effect announced over 200 truckloads and hundreds of tons worth of aid does continue to go in via the Egyptians, and so that is kind of
but there has been a lot of criticism. Sorry to interrupt you, Richard. There has been a lot of criticism of Israel as well in terms of that aid getting to people in Gaza. Of course, a lot of how it is distributed is through UNRWA, which has very, very close links, and indeed funding has been stopped by many countries, including the UK, because of the UN agency's links to Hamas, to those who support it, the fact that underneath a hospital, the biggest hospital actually in Gaza, there was found to be technology supporting Hamas as well. So this is a very, very big controversial issue. And of course, the victims of this are the people, the innocent civilians in Gaza who require the food, the water, the supplies. We can see on the screen some pictures of desperate people trying to carry some of that aid just so they can be fed and live.
Absolutely. I mean, the international community, along with Israel's investigations on how this was allowed to happen, and and be perpetrated, the international community needs to ask itself some very difficult questions as well of all the investment that's gone into the UN institutions and UNRWA in particular in Gaza that have found themselves culpable and compromised in the extreme with the way that they have cooperated with Hamas over the years and UN institutions and other facilities being used either in direct cooperation or turning a blind eye, and that's a real concern. Israel will always, in the prosecution of this war, has always made the distinction between targeting Hamas terrorists and those non-involved innocent Palestinians that should be kept away from the fighting and should certainly receive as much aid as possible.
Yet there are so many innocent. I mean, look, in a war, unfortunately, civilians die, but there have been probably tens of thousands of innocent civilians in Gaza who have died as a result of Israel's actions. That is a fact.
I think so. Well, listen, we still don't know exactly. We say the facts, but we've got the only numbers we have to go on is the Hamas-run
and we must be skeptical
health
about
ministry in Gaza. So there is a question mark over some of those numbers, but hopefully will become clearer in time. According to the Israel, even if we take those Hamas numbers of around 30,000, Israel is claiming that at least half of those have been Hamas militants, combatants, terrorists.
Let's just call them terrorists, Richard.
Absolutely, yes. That's what they are indeed. And so, if half of them, that takes a ratio of 1-to-1, which there are some military analysts that are suggesting that in such an intense and densely fought areas of urban warfare, this is kind of a model for future operations of how you can limit casualties that are non-involved. And so I think that we should wait until we have better clarity on those numbers.
Of course, there'll be people who disagree with what you say, but I just wonder, in terms of aid agencies themselves, just to slightly go back to what you're saying a minute ago, I mean, they didn't seem to notice Hamas's tunnel construction ongoing for many years. Can we really trust what some of the aid agencies are actually telling us in regard to this? They would argue, probably privately rather than publicly, that they had to work with Hamas because Hamas were controlling Gaza, and that was something that they absolutely had to do prior to the 7th of October, and there's a legacy there, isn't there?
I think that's true to an extent. Again, the questions need to be asked by those agencies of how complicit they were with the Hamas infrastructure they were building. I mean, of course, no one had any idea that they were planning this October the 7th massacre, and that's what it would be a result of. But the very fact that is coming to light in Israeli intelligence also were not aware to the full extent of the subterranean labyrinth of tunnels and the enormous investment made. I mean, just imagine if that money would have been invested in educational institutions, in hospitals, in good governance, how much different that would have made to the lives of the Palestinians in Gaza.
It just comes back to the fact, Richard, that Hamas does not care about the people of Gaza. It doesn't care about the Palestinians. It doesn't really care about a peaceable solution. They are terrorists who didn't care about their own people. They didn't invest in all those things you mentioned, schools, infrastructure. You know, the reason that Gaza was in such a terrible place was down to the people who ran it from 2005, Hamas. Listen, thank you very much indeed to Richard Peter there from BICOM. Appreciate you joining us today. That's the British Israeli Communications and Research Centre.